Taking care of an orchid involves mastering a few key elements. They need the right balance of light, water, humidity, and temperature to thrive. You'll also need to fertilize them regularly and know when to repot them to keep them happy and healthy. In this guide, we'll break down everything you need to know about orchid care, from finding the perfect spot in your home to ensuring they bloom beautifully year after year. Whether you're a newbie or an orchid enthusiast, we've got tips that will help you keep your orchids in tip-top shape. Let's get into it. Let's start with the most common orchids you're likely to encounter: Phalaenopsis, Cattleya, and Dendrobium. Phalaenopsis, also known as the moth orchid, is the one you'll often see in big box stores. It's popular because it's relatively easy to care for and blooms for months. It loves bright, indirect light and prefers a humid environment, making it a perfect choice for beginners. Cattleya orchids are the classic corsage orchids, known for their large, fragrant flowers. They need a bit more light than Phalaenopsis, so placing them near an east-facing window is ideal. These beauties also like to dry out between waterings, so make sure you're not keeping them too damp. Then there's Dendrobium, a diverse group with a variety of needs, but generally they enjoy bright light and cooler temperatures. They're a bit more forgiving if you miss a watering or two, which makes them a good choice if you're prone to the occasional neglect. Understanding your orchid's specific variety helps you tailor its care to its unique needs. Not sure what you've got? Look at the shape and size of the flowers, the growth pattern, and even the leaves. A little research or a quick trip to your local nursery can help you nail down the ID. Once you know your orchid's type, you can give it the best possible care. When it comes to orchids, lighting is everything. These plants thrive on bright, indirect light, which mimics the dappled sunlight they'd get in their native tropical environments. Most orchids, especially popular types like Phalaenopsis and Cattleya, do best near an east or south-facing window, where they can soak up plenty of light without getting scorched by direct sun. If the light is too intense, you might notice the leaves turning yellow, which is a sign that they're getting sunburned. On the other hand, if your orchid isn't getting enough light, the leaves might turn dark green and the plant could struggle to bloom. To find that sweet spot, place your orchid in a location where it gets bright light for several hours a day, but not direct midday sun, which can be too harsh. If your home doesn't have ideal natural light, consider using a sheer curtain to diffuse the sunlight or even supplementing with a grow light if needed. Keep an eye on the leaves. Medium green leaves with a slight yellow tint usually indicate that your orchid is getting just the right amount of light. If you're not seeing blooms, or if the plant looks a little too dark and lush, it might be time to move it to a brighter spot. Adjusting the light levels is an ongoing process, especially as the seasons change and the amount of daylight varies. By paying attention to the signals your orchid is giving you, you can tweak its environment to keep it thriving all year round. Generally, how often you water depends on the type of orchid and your home's environment. For instance, Phalaenopsis orchids usually need watering about once a week, while other types like Dendrobiums might prefer a bit less frequent watering. The key is to let the potting medium dry out slightly between waterings. Orchids like their roots to breathe, and overwatering is the quickest way to give your plant a case of root rot, which can be fatal. If you're unsure, it's always better to err on the side of underwatering rather than overwatering. The best way to water your orchid is using the soak and drain method. Place the pot in a sink or a container, then gently pour lukewarm water over the potting medium until it's soaked through. Let the pot drain completely before returning the orchid to its spot. Orchids hate sitting in water. Be careful to keep water off the leaves and especially out of the crown, the center of the plant where the leaves meet, as standing water there can lead to rot. Orchids also love humidity, so keeping the air around them moist is key to their happiness. Ideally, they prefer humidity levels between 40% to 70%. If you live in a dry climate or it's winter and your indoor air is dry, you can increase humidity by misting the plant regularly, placing a humidity tray filled with water and pebbles beneath the pot, or using a small humidifier nearby. Just be careful not to overdo it. Too much misting can encourage fungal problems. Orchids are a bit particular about their temperature preferences, but once you know what they like, it's easy to keep them comfortable. Most orchids thrive in daytime temperatures between 65 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit, with a nighttime drop to about 55 to 65 degrees. This fluctuation mimics the natural environment of many orchids, where cooler nights are a normal part of their growing conditions. If your home gets too warm or too cold, especially at night, it can stress your orchid and impact its blooming cycle. During the winter months, if your home tends to get chilly, consider moving your orchid to a slightly warmer spot, but avoid placing it near heating vents where the air might get too dry. Air circulation is just as important as temperature for orchid health. Good airflow helps prevent mold, mildew, and other diseases that can thrive in stagnant, humid environments. However, while orchids appreciate a gentle breeze, they don't like being blasted with cold drafts. If you're using a fan to keep the air moving, make sure it's set on low and positioned so that the airflow is indirect. This keeps the air around the orchid fresh without causing temperature fluctuations or drying out the plant too much. When it comes to fertilizing orchids, it's all about giving them the right nutrients without overwhelming them. Orchids aren't heavy feeders, but they do benefit from a regular supply of nutrients, especially during their growth periods. The first step is choosing the right fertilizer. You'll find orchid-specific fertilizers on the market, and these are great because they're formulated with the right balance of nutrients orchids need. A balanced fertilizer like 20-20-20 is a good all-rounder, providing equal parts nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. During active growth periods, particularly when new leaves or roots are forming, you might want to use a fertilizer with a slightly higher nitrogen content to promote robust growth. As for the fertilizing schedule, the weekly approach is a popular method among orchid enthusiasts. This means you fertilize every week with a diluted solution, typically about a quarter of the strength recommended on the fertilizer label. This steady, gentle feeding keeps your orchid nourished without the risk of over-fertilization, which can cause more harm than good. During periods of dormancy, when the orchid isn't actively growing, you can cut back on fertilization or stop altogether. Just resume when you see new growth beginning. Knowing when to repot your orchid is crucial for keeping it healthy and thriving. One of the telltale signs that it's time for a new pot is when you see roots spilling out over the edges or growing out of the drainage holes. Another indicator is the condition of the potting medium. If it looks like it's breaking down or has become compacted, it's time to repot. Typically, orchids should be repotted every 1 to 2 years to refresh their growing environment and give them more room to expand. The best time to repot is right after your orchid has finished blooming and before it enters a new growth phase, usually in the spring or early summer. The repotting process might seem daunting, but it's pretty straightforward with a bit of care. Start by gently removing the orchid from its current pot, being careful not to damage the roots. If the roots are tangled or attached to the pot, you can use sterilized scissors to carefully trim them. Shake off the old potting medium from the roots and take the opportunity to prune any dead or damaged roots. Next, choose a new pot that is just slightly larger than the old one. Orchids actually prefer snug pots. It's also essential to select the right potting medium. Orchids do best in a mix designed to provide plenty of air circulation to the roots, typically made of materials like bark, perlite, and charcoal. Place a layer of the new potting medium in the bottom of the pot, position the orchid in the center, and fill in around the roots with more medium, gently pressing it down to secure the plant without compacting it too much. After repotting, water the orchid lightly to help settle the new potting medium and place it back in its usual spot. Hold off on fertilizing for a few weeks to give the orchid time to adjust to its new environment. And that's your crash course in orchid care. With the right balance of light, water, temperature, and a little bit of attention to feeding and repotting, your orchids can thrive and keep blooming beautifully year after year. Don't be intimidated by their exotic looks. Just follow these steps, and you'll have a healthy, happy plant that's sure to impress. If you found these tips helpful, hit that subscribe button and join our community of plant lovers for more gardening advice. And let us know in the comments how your orchids are doing. We'd love to hear from you. Happy growing.